You would hear her before you saw her. The laugh came first, loud and rough, more like a horse than a lady, cutting across rooms full of the most carefully mannered people in America. They had trained their whole lives to be quiet and smooth and correct. She had trained herself to do the opposite. Her name was Mamie Fish, though almost no one called her that. To New York, she was Mamie. The first time I read the things she said to people's faces, I assumed someone had cleaned them up or made them worse. They had done neither. She meant every word, and she said them on purpose. Here is the puzzle at the center of her story. Mamie Fish could barely read. She could barely write. By her own account, she had almost no schooling at all. And yet for the better part of 20 years, she ruled the richest and most educated families in the country. The people who summered in marble cottages and married their daughters to European lords. She did not climb by being graceful. She climbed by being funny and a little cruel and entirely unafraid. She turned the whole glittering world of high society into her own private joke, and the people inside it laughed along because the alternative was to be left out. It cost her, in the end, more than she expected. But that part comes later. For now, picture the laugh, and the woman who said out loud what everyone else was only thinking. The insult as a calling card. A guest arriving at her door got a warm welcome and a small wound in the same breath. She would take the hand, hold the eye, and deliver the line she had made famous. She hoped you would make yourself at home, she would say, because no one alive wished you there more than she did. It should have emptied her ballroom. Instead, it filled it. Mamie understood something the rest of her world refused to admit. The people around her were bored. They had inherited everything and earned nothing, and their evenings ran on the same dull rails year after year. The same older faces, the same younger clothes, worn to the same long dinners where nobody ever said anything true. So she broke the rails. She decided the worst sin a hostess could commit was not rudeness, but dullness, and she built her reputation on its opposite. Take the dinners. Across high society, a formal meal could crawl on for hours, course after course, while the guests wilted in the heat and the candle smoke. Mamie thought this was torture dressed up as honor. She perfected a shorter version instead, a dinner that ran for about 50 minutes and moved at a clip that left no room to sag. Then she gave them something they did not expect. She brought in performers from the popular stage, the kind of acts a respectable family would never admit to enjoying. She set them loose in front of the very people who pretended to sit above such things, and the room laughed in spite of itself. Her invitations made the promise plain. "There will be something besides dinner," she wrote. "Come." The insults were part of the show. She aimed them at everyone, and the higher the target, the better. A duchess and a duke could be cut down at the same table before either had the chance to recover. She did it lightly, with a smile, which made it impossible to answer. To complain was to admit you had been wounded. To laugh was to surrender. I have gone looking for the trick behind it, the calculation that turned cruelty into charm, and I am not sure there was one. She seems to have simply meant it, and meant it cheerfully. That cheerfulness was the whole secret. A snob who insults you is unbearable. A woman who insults you while plainly delighting in it, and inviting you to delight in it too, was something the bored rich had never met. Her parties became the ones you could not afford to skip. Not because they were splendid, but because anything might happen, and most of it would happen at your expense. What stays with me is how little she cared whether you liked her. She was not trying to be loved, she was trying to be impossible to ignore. The court jester, nobody took seriously. The men of New York could not understand what the women saw in Harry Lehr. He had no fortune, no title, and no obvious talent. Most of them wrote him off as a harmless fop, a man who cared more about gowns and gossip than anything a serious person should bother with. That dismissal was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because the husbands decided he was no threat, they handed him the one duty they could not stand to perform. He squired their wives to lunches and fittings and afternoon calls. He sat patiently through the rituals they avoided. Best of all, he made those women feel clever and adored, which most of their husbands had long since given up trying to do. He had one real gift, and that gift was attention. Caroline Astor noticed him first and found him good company. But it was Mamie Fish who made him essential. The two of them recognized each other almost on sight. They shared a taste for the absurd, a very low patience for boredom, and a delight in puncturing anyone who took themselves too seriously. Together, they were something the drawing rooms had never seen. She supplied the house, the money, and the nerve. He supplied the staging, the scripts, and the straight face. The strangest schemes that ran through her parties were cooked up by the two of them in private. What looked like pure mischief was really a kind of theatre, and Lehr was the one who made it run. Her husband watched it all with a tired fondness and kept well out of the way. I keep trying to decide whether Harry Lehr was a genius or a parasite, and the honest answer is that he was both at the same time. Then there is the matter of his marriage, which is where the comedy ends. Living among the rich was expensive, and the money to do it had to come from somewhere. So he married a gentle young widow named Elizabeth Drexel, who had a great deal of it. On their wedding night, she had laid out his favourite supper and bought him a fine watch as a gift. He arrived, sat down, and told her plainly what the marriage was. It was a business arrangement. He had married her for her fortune. He did not love her, and he despised women in general, and her in particular. He would be charming to her in public, he promised. He kept that promise, and only that one. She never left him. Her mother would not hear of a divorce. So Elizabeth stayed, year after year, beside a husband who had told her exactly where she stood. Long after he died, she wrote the whole story down, and her book is a large part of why we know what these parties were truly like. There is a detail in that wedding night I cannot shake. The man who could set a whole ballroom laughing on command spent his private hours making certain that one woman never smiled at him again. The jester saved all his cruelty for the single person who was not allowed to leave the room. The night she crowned a false Tsar, 200 of the richest people in Newport stood in her hall, dressed for royalty, waiting to meet a Russian prince. The hour for dinner came and went. The prince did not. To see how she ended up in that corner, and how she turned it into the finest night of her summer, you have to go back to the cause. The cause, as so often in that world, was almost nothing at all. Mamie had a rival named Mrs. Ogden Gourlay, a fellow hostess with a fortune of her own and a long memory. The two women were locked in a quarrel over a young bachelor named James de Wolfe Cutting. Who could claim him? Who could be seen with him? These were the stakes. To an outsider, it sounds like a squabble between school children. To them, it was open war. In the late summer of 1902, a genuine Russian royal arrived in Newport. Grand Duke Boris was a cousin of the Tsar and a celebrated playboy, the precise kind of titled visitor that Newport lost its head over. He was staying under Mrs. Gourlay's roof. Mamie, never one to be outdone, announced a grand dinner and ball in his honour at Crossways. There was only one problem. Mamie would not invite Jimmy Cutting. Mrs. Gourlay insisted that he be included. Mamie refused again. So Gourlay played the single card she held. She kept the Grand Duke quietly at home, and left her rival to host a party for a man who would never arrive. It was a perfect trap. A dinner in honor of a prince, with no prince, staged in front of the 200 people whose opinion she cared about most. I have read more than one account of what happened next, and the small details shift from telling to telling, but the ending never changes. The crowd assembled. The clock moved on. Whispers began to circle the room about why the man they had dressed for was nowhere in sight. And then, instead of an apology, Mamie stepped forward and made an announcement. The Grand Duke could not attend, she explained, but she had secured a replacement. In his place, the Tsar of Russia himself had agreed to be her guest of honor. The great doors at the far end of the hall swung open. In he strode, His Imperial Majesty, ruler of all the Russias, wrapped in heavy robes, a crown on his head and a scepter in his fist, advancing through the stunned crowd with tremendous solemnity. It was Harry Lehr. The room came apart. The empty chair that was supposed to shame her had become the most talked-of moment in all of Newport that year. Every bit of the joke now ran in her favor. Even Boris, when word of it reached him, was said to have thought it marvelous. Look closely at what she had managed. Her rival had set out to humiliate her in front of everyone who counted. Inside a single hour, Mamie had seized that humiliation, flipped it over, and reduced Mrs. Gilded's careful scheme to nothing. She had not triumphed by being richer or more refined. She won because she refused to be embarrassed, and because she thought faster than anyone else in the room. I think this is the moment that explains why even a duchess thought twice before crossing her. Mamie could not stop you from snubbing her. She could only guarantee that your snub became the joke of the season, and that she was the one who got to tell it. The outsiders she let through the door. A stage comedian once caught Mamie Fish across the head with a leak. As the story is usually told, that is how the two of them became friends. The comedian was Marie Dressler, who would go on to become a film star. She was loud, common by the standards of Mamie's circle, and precisely the sort of woman the old families would never have received. A reigning society queen and a knockabout stage performer had no business keeping company. They kept it anyway, and Mamie made no secret of how much she enjoyed it. This is the part of the story that does not fit the picture of the cruel hostess. The world she lived in ran on one unbreakable rule about who belonged. You belonged by blood, by old money, by the right name carried for the right number of generations. Talent did not count. Charm did not count. An ordinary past was a permanent stain. Mamie thought the rule was nonsense. When a young actress named Edith Kingdon married into the very rich Gould family, society shut its doors on her. She had earned her own living on the stage, which made her unfit in their eyes, no matter whose ring she now wore. Mamie disagreed, and Mamie had the standing to disagree out loud. A word from her could carry a person out of the cold and into the lighted rooms, and she spent that word on a woman the rest of them had crossed off. I like her best in this part of the story. The reason had nothing to do with charity. Mamie simply did not care where you came from. She cared whether you were dull. A duchess who bored her was worthless to her. A comedian who made her sit up was worth more than a roomful of inherited names. To a circle that weighed everything by ancestry, that was very close to heresy. It would be easy to turn her into a simple villain, and the record will not allow it. The same indifference to the rules that let her wound a duke at dinner also let her open a door that everyone else kept locked. She was not kind, exactly. She was something rarer in that world. She was free. A White House on a street of palaces. Up and down the avenue, the richest families in America were building Europe. Along the cliffs of Newport, they raised French chateaux, Italian villas, and marble copies of the very palaces their grandfathers had crossed an ocean to escape. The point was to look old and foreign and important. To belong on that street, your summer place had to pretend it had been carried over whole from the old world. Mamie Fish looked at all of it and built something American instead. Her cottage stood on a rocky rise off Ocean Avenue, and she had chosen its name, Crossways, before the first stone was laid. It was white and plain in its lines. The model was the kind of home a wealthy planter might have built in the American South a century and a half before. 4 enormous columns held up the front portico, and there was nothing French about any of it, nothing borrowed from a duke. In a colony of imitation castles, she had raised a frank and homegrown house, and she had done it on purpose. She did not even hire one of the fashionable society architects. The job went to a local Newport man named Dudley Newton, and the place was built by local hands rather than imported European craftsmen. For years afterward, people assumed it must be the work of the famous Stanford White, because surely a hostess of her standing would settle for nothing less. It was not. White designed her townhouse in the city. Crossways belonged to Newton and to Mamie, who had pushed her husband to build it in the first place. Nor was it especially costly by the measure of that street. Her neighbours poured millions into their marble. Crossways went up for a reported $100,000, a small fraction of what stood on either side of it. The proud old families spent fortunes trying to look like Versailles. Mamie spent far less and looked like no one but herself. What I admire about the choice is how little it cost her to make it. Inside, the place was shaped for one purpose above all others, the filling of its rooms with people. The dining room could seat about 80 at a single table. She laid that table with a gold service of 300 pieces. It was the kind of display that told you the plain white walls outside were a decision, not a shortage of money. The drawing room was large enough to double as a ballroom by 1913, with even some 40 rooms starting to feel tight. She added a true ballroom at the back. That new wing had a job to do. Each August, she closed the entire Newport season with her Harvest Festival Ball, and Crossways was where the long summer came to rest. I have spent some time with the floor plans, and they give her away. Almost every line of the building bends toward the gathering of a crowd and the staging of an evening. The house said something the rest of the avenue could not. It announced that an American fortune did not need to disguise itself as a European one to be taken seriously. The cottages around her borrowed the look of palaces and copied the stonework of the old world. Mamie built a place confident enough to be plainly, almost stubbornly, of its own country. When it opened in the summer of 1898, the housewarming was not a costume ball in the French taste. It was an American barn dance. There was one thing she carried into every home she ever kept. This one included. A polar bear rug, white and faintly ridiculous, spread across the floor wherever she lived. In a mansion that told all of Newport exactly who she was, the rug was the small private joke she saved for herself. The prince who turned out to be a monkey. The most famous thing Mamie Fish ever did may never have happened. It is the tale that trails her name through every history of the age, repeated so often that it has hardened into fact. And the closer you look, the more it slips between your fingers. I cannot prove a word of what comes next, and I'm going to tell it to you anyway, because the story matters whether or not it is true. Word reached Newport in the summer of 1902 by the usual telling that a foreign nobleman was bound for the resort. He was said to be Prince del Drago, a title carried over from Corsica, exactly the sort of catch that sent the whole place into a flutter. Mamie sent out her invitations. Everyone who mattered scrambled for a seat at her table, eager to meet a real prince, and more than one mother pictured a daughter at his elbow. On the night, the doors opened, and in came the guest of honor in white tie and tails, groomed and silent and very small. He was a monkey, not a prince, and not from Corsica, but a trained animal in formal dress, led in to take the place of honor. In the bolder versions, the little visitor behaved just as a monkey at a banquet would. He took champagne. He turned mischievous. Before long, he is supposed to have scrambled up into the chandelier and begun flinging bulbs down on the finest people in Newport while they scattered beneath him. Some tellings even give the creature a name. Here is the part the storytellers tend to leave out. The more I looked into it, the less solid the whole thing became. Harry Lehr, the one man who would have stood at the centre of any such evening, flatly denied that a monkey dinner had ever taken place. The popular versions fix it firmly in 1902, while a report from a few years later set it in a different year altogether. Even the house is in doubt. Some place it at Crossways. Others put it elsewhere along the avenue. And the animal itself is now and then credited not to Mamie at all, but to another rich host who supplied it for sport. So we are left with a story that almost certainly swelled in the retelling and may have grown from nothing whatever, and still it will not die. The reason, I think, is that it is simply too accurate to give up. Look at what the hoax says about that world. These were people so hungry for a European title in the family that they would fawn over any stranger who claimed one. A monkey in evening dress could be passed off as nobility, and the richest families in the country would dress for dinner and come running. That hunger was the great weakness of her set, and Mamie had a sharp eye for weakness. Their craving for an imported title left them easy to mock, and far too proud to be shamed out of the habit. There is at least one of her animal banquets that we can stand on firmer ground with. By reports from the period, she once held a dinner for the dogs of Newport, roughly 100 of them, brought by their owners and seated as guests. They arrived in fine collars, some of them glittering. They were served a feast of their own, course by course, while their owners looked on with pride. One overfed little dachshund, the story goes, ate itself straight into a faint. That one has the ring of something that really occurred, and it carries the same blade hidden inside the comedy. She was holding a mirror to a society that would turn anything it owned, down to its lapdogs, into an excuse for display. I have stopped trying to settle whether it ever reached that chandelier. The better question is the one you are likely already asking. Why has a tale that no one can prove outlasted nearly everything that is documented about her? Because a legend only takes hold when it tells the truth about the people who keep passing it along. The husband who let her. In every story about Mamie Fish, there is a quiet man somewhere near the edge of the room, watching. That man was her husband, and he could have put a stop to almost any of it. He never once tried. Stuyvesant Fish was as steady as his wife was wild. He came from an old and deeply respected New York family, the kind whose name opened any door in the city without a word spoken. His father, Hamilton Fish, had been governor of the state, then a United States senator, and then Secretary of State under President Grant. Few names in the country carried more weight. To be a Fish was to carry a piece of the nation's own history on your back. Here is the quiet irony at the center of their marriage. The woman who could barely read had married straight into all of that dignity and good breeding. She supplied the wit and the daring. He supplied the name and the long, settled fortune that came with it. And he was no idle gentleman trailing after a famous wife. In 1887, he became president of the Illinois Central Railroad. For close to 20 years he ran it, guiding the road through the greatest stretch of growth in its history. While his wife was busy conquering ballrooms, he was directing a railroad that reached clear across the middle of the country. He sat on bankboards. He was taken seriously by serious men. None of it ever reached the gossip columns, because steadiness is not interesting, and his wife was. The marriage itself was older than any of the parties. They had known each other since childhood and married in 1876, when both of them were young. In a set where marriages were treaties and affairs were simply expected, theirs was a rarer thing. It was a love match, and it held. They had 4 children, and they buried one in infancy. I had to remind myself, reading through all the bright stories about her, that they had lost a child, that grief never appears in a single one of them. What he gave her, more than the name or the money, was room to be herself. When she filled his houses with comedians and staged her small outrages, he did not scold, and he did not interfere. He let it run, and looked on with something close to pride at the one thing his wife did better than anyone alive. It is tempting to read him as a doormat, a dull man left in the shade of a dazzling wife. I think that is exactly wrong. It takes a quiet strength to stand beside someone far louder than yourself and feel no need to compete. Stuyvesant had nothing left to prove. The name was already his. The fortune was already made. The wife he had loved since boyhood was the most famous woman in the country, and he could afford to let her shine without ever flinching. A smaller man would have tried to dim her. He simply held the door. Mamie knew exactly what she had. Late in her life, she said that a good husband was the best possession any woman could have. Coming from a woman who made a sport of skewering everyone within reach, that was about as near to a confession as she ever came. Of everyone in this story, he is the one I understand least and respect most. She mocked nearly everything: the titles, the manners, the duchesses, the whole gilded performance of the age. The single thing she never turned into a joke was the steady man who stood back and let her mock all the rest. The snub that cost an empire. In 1906, Stuyvesant Fish lost the railroad. After almost 20 years at the head of the Illinois Central, he was forced out of the presidency. The company he had carried through its biggest years of growth was taken from him, and he was left with nothing to show for the work. For a man of his name and his record, it was a public humiliation of the highest order. The steady husband, who had always stood quietly behind his dazzling wife, was suddenly the one in the newspapers, and not for anything he had wanted. The man who took the railroad from him was Edward Harriman, the most powerful railroad financier in the country. Harriman controlled the Union Pacific and laid his hand over a great share of the lines across the West. He was a man who took what he wanted and apologized to no one. He and Stuyvesant had once been partners of a kind. By 1906, they were enemies. Harriman had quietly gathered enough of the Illinois Central Board to do exactly as he pleased, and when the vote came, he had the numbers, and Stuyvesant did not. The president fought it hard and fought it in the open. He lost anyway, voted out of the company he had run for a generation. The reason given was a tangle of money and insurance. Stuyvesant had become caught up in the enormous scandal then engulfing the great life insurance firms, and he had sided with the investigators digging into mutual life. That stance set him against powerful interests, with Harriman among them. On paper, that is why he fell. But there is another story, and it is the one that has clung to his ruin ever since. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly where the tale turns seductive and the facts turn thin. By this version, the true wound was never financial. It was social. Edward Harriman had a wife, Mary, and Mamie Fish had decided that Mary Harriman was dull. So Mamie did to her what she did to dull people everywhere. She left Mary off the guest list for a tea at Crossways, a small and deliberate cut delivered in front of exactly the right witnesses. The theory runs that Harriman, slighted through his wife, never forgave it. He took his revenge not across a tea table, but across a boardroom, by stripping her husband of his life's work. I have weighed that theory against the ledgers, and the ledgers win. A man like Harriman did not unseat a railroad president over a missing tea invitation. He moved against Stuyvesant because it tightened his grip on the company, and the insurance fight handed him the opening he had been waiting for. And yet the slight refuses to leave the story alone because it points at something genuinely true. In that world, the drawing room and the boardroom were never the separate places they pretended to be. The same families ruled both. A wife who humiliated the wrong woman over the teacups could, at the very least, harden a powerful man's resolve. She could grease the wheels of a decision he was already leaning toward. I think the truth is sadder and simpler than the legend. We had watched Mamie cut and skewer everyone within reach, and every time it played as sport. It was the great delight of Newport, the very reason to accept her invitations. Whether or not her tongue ever touched this particular ruin, the shape of the thing is the same. The careless cruelty that thrilled a ballroom was the same blade that, in the wrong room, could draw real blood. And the man it cost most was the one person who had only ever shielded her. Stuyvesant never returned to the height he had lost. He lived another 17 years in the long shadow of that single defeat. We will never know for certain whether a slighted woman at a tea table helped take her husband's life's work from him. The money was very likely enough on its own. But the question has trailed the Fishes for more than 100 years, and it has never quite been laid to rest. Queen of a vanishing world. What is a throne worth, once the kingdom around it has begun to fall? In 1908, Caroline Astor died. For more than a generation, she had sat at the undisputed head of New York society, the one woman whose blessing settled who belonged and who did not. When she was gone, the very top of that world stood empty. The woman widely seen as her heir was Mamie Fish. Think of how far that is. The girl who could barely read had arrived loud and unwelcome. Now she was counted among the rulers of the society that had once looked straight through her. She did not hold the throne alone. She shared it with two other powerful hostesses, Alva Belmont and Tessie Ulrichs, the three of them splitting the kingdom that Caroline Astor had governed by herself. But Mamie had made it. The fun-maker who could barely spell stood at the summit at last. Before the Palazzo Uptown, the Fishes had kept a house on Gramercy Park. The move to a tall mansion at 25 East 78th Street, on the corner of Madison Avenue, built for her by the celebrated architect Stanford White, was a statement of arrival. It was formal and exacting and a little forbidding, and she knew precisely what it was. She once said that it would be an uncomfortable place for anyone without breeding. Even her houses were permitted to be a little cruel. But look hard at the timing, because it is merciless. She reached the top of society in 1908. Only 2 years before, the railroad had been taken from her husband. In the same brief stretch of years, the Fishes lost the empire that had paid for all of it, and won a social crown that money could no longer quite buy. There is a cruelty in that timing that I do not think she missed. And a far larger ending was already underway. The whole Gilded world was sliding toward its close. Caroline Astor's death was not only the loss of one woman, it was the passing of the rigid old order she had stood for. A different century had arrived, with newer fortunes and looser manners. Ahead of it lay a tax on the great incomes and a war that would swallow the old Europe these families had worshipped. The kingdom Mamie had finally conquered was dissolving beneath her feet. Her final summers at Newport had the light of a sunset about them. She went on giving her huge themed balls, dressing her guests as flowers and as nursery rhymes, closing the calendar in the grand old manner. But the world that had once made those evenings matter was thinning, year by year, guest by guest. I have come to think the real story of her last years is not the throne, but the slowly emptying room around it. She had spent her whole life mocking this world, puncturing its vanities, showing how hollow its pride truly was. And then she climbed to the very top of it, arriving just in time to watch it fade into memory. The last great joke of her life was one she never got to tell. It was the throne itself, won at the exact moment the kingdom stopped mattering. The Long Walk at Glencliff. In the spring of 1915, Mamie Fish went for a walk. There was nothing unusual in it. She was 61 and believed to be in fine health, and at Glencliff, her country place above the Hudson, she walked nearly every day. The grounds had turned green again after the winter. She set out in the afternoon and went a long way, perhaps farther than she should have, and she came back tired. None of it seemed to mean a thing at the time. Glencliff was the quietest of her three great homes, and the one that was truly hers in spirit. It stood among the hills near the village of Garrison, on the Hudson, and it had belonged to the Fish family for 2 generations. Stuyvesant's father, the old Senator Hamilton Fish, had built it in 1861. When the place passed to Stuyvesant, Mamie decided it was far too small, and she did what she always did. She made it bigger, and she made it hers, enlarging it until it held 15 bedrooms. Her own room she had done up entirely in pink. This was no stage like the White Mansion at Newport. Here she kept only her weekend gatherings and her yearly dance at Halloween. The guests were friends, the scale was homely, and the whole estate ran at a gentler pace. Glencliff was where the loudest woman in America went to be still. There is something telling in that pink room, tucked far from every audience she ever played to. The woman who armoured herself in wit and gold service kept one place, high above the Hudson, where she did not have to perform at all. The day after the long walk, she kept to her room. She was wearier than any walk could explain. The morning after that, a blood vessel gave way in her brain, and on the 25th of May, she died there, in the pink room, 61 years old. A doctor came up from the next town, but it was already beyond help. I did not expect the end of all this noise to be so quiet. Think of it. The woman who had filled ballrooms with comedians and seated a monkey at her own table met her guests at the door with a smile and a small cruelty, and then she slipped out of the world without a sound. There was no crowd this time. There was no audience, no stunt, and no punchline. She left in the middle of an ordinary spring afternoon in a country bedroom with the door closed. Stuyvesant outlived her by 8 years. He died in 1923, and he was laid to rest beside her at the small church of St. Philip near Garrison. And there, with the two of them, lies the infant child they had buried so long before. The little family that none of the bright stories ever mentioned was whole again at the last. The party that haunts me is the one she never lived to host, for she died at the cruelest possible moment, and somehow the most fitting one. The end came only days before the 1st of June, her 39th wedding anniversary, and within a week of her own birthday. A celebration for both had already been arranged at Glencliff. The invitations were out. The rooms would have been full of the people she loved to command. The greatest hostess of her age died just before the last great party in her honour, the one she would never get to give. The houses are still there if you go looking. Crossways, the white American house she built to spite a street full of European palaces, still stands above Ocean Avenue at Newport, though it has been carved up into apartments now, and other people sleep where her gold service once gleamed. Her tall mansion on 78th Street still holds its corner in the city, owned today by one of the richest men in New York, a former mayor. The buildings outlived the woman, the fortune, and the whole world that filled them. They are the physical evidence that she was real. She left no dynasty. The railroad was gone before she was. There was no great fish fortune handed down the generations, no foundation, no museum wing with her name above the door. By the cold measure of her world, she ought to have been forgotten, the way so many richer and grander names have been forgotten. And yet here we are, still telling her stories. More than 100 years after her death, a monkey that may never have existed still climbs her chandelier in books and articles. She turns up as a character in a popular series about her age. A new biography carries her name across its cover. The woman who could barely read is read about constantly. Something about that feels exactly right to me. She spent her whole life wanting to be impossible to ignore, and a century later she still is. If you ask me why we remember her, when so many wealthier names have slipped into the dark, the answer is the simplest thing in the world. She was funny. In a world that took itself with deadly seriousness, that copied kings and worshipped titles and treated a dinner invitation like a matter of state, she was the one willing to laugh at all of it. She punctured the whole solemn performance, and she did it from the inside, standing at the very top. That is a far rarer thing than money, and it lasts a great deal longer. So if you ever pass that White House at Newport, you might stop for a moment and listen. You will hear nothing, of course. But once, the loudest sound on that entire respectable avenue was a woman laughing, too hard and too long, at a joke the rest of them were only starting to understand